One of the things that people really care about is making sure that organizations are held accountable when things go sideways. We want to monitor, we want to check in on those organizations to make sure they're doing the right thing. So, for instance, you might think about how companies get audited constantly to make sure that things are on the financial up and up, right? There are third party auditors, for example, to make sure that the company's not doing anything financially untoward. We also have there are various kinds of oversight. Congress oversees certain kinds of things. Now, in order for that oversight to happen, what you want is transparency. You need organizations to be transparent about various kinds of facts about how their operation works, about, say, what kind of money they took in, what they spent their money on, et cetera, et cetera. So, in order to provide that kind of oversight, what's often needed is measurements. The people who are overseeing want to measure success. You can't just sort of ask, hey, how you doing there? And it can't just be, it seems anyway, it can't just be something like, yeah, let's take a look and we'll make a judgment call. The go-to move is to measure certain things. So we need two kinds of things in order to make sure that organizations are doing what they said they would do. For instance, being compliant with laws and regulations. Now, in order for companies to do that, in order for us to have that kind of oversight, we need that transparency. And so there seems to be this really tight connection between transparency by those organizations on the one hand and measuring on the other to make sure that things are on the up and up. Okay, that's the standard view. Now, this is big in the world of, for instance, AI ethics or responsible AI or regulations in AI, which are coming, especially in the European Union, where we want transparency so that we can make sure that they're being compliant with AI regulations, and we want them to be compliant with AI regulations so that things don't go totally off the rail and people don't get killed and harmed in other kinds of ways. Okay, all makes sense so far. In fact, if you look at the ethics statements, the AI ethics statements or the responsible AI statements that you see, I mean, if you take a look, there are hundreds or thousands of them. Organizations, especially Fortune 500, Global 1000 companies, put these things out and say, these are our AI ethics principles. And you will see on every single one of them, I would bet without fail, transparency is a value of theirs. Now, one thing that I find generally frustrating about all this talk about transparency is that if you just say we're for transparency, it's rather vague because no one's going to be transparent about everything with everyone. That's just not on the table, right? At a bare minimum, you don't want to reveal your intellectual property if you're a large company or a small company. So I find the talk about transparency already kind of frustrating because it's not specific enough with regards to what people should be transparent about, with whom, etc. Okay. But then I came across this paper by Thi Nguyen, Transparency is Surveillance. Now that sort of smacked me in the face. And it smacked me in the face because we think about transparency as the thing that is good. In the context of ethics, usually the term surveillance is used in a pejorative sense. That is, we use the term surveillance to indicate something bad is going on. So this paper, geniusly titled Transparency is Surveillance, really caught my attention because it was clearly intending to, I think it was anyway, intending to bring out that there's something really potentially bad about being transparent, about transparency. So, of course, I read the paper, it was fascinating, and I reached out to T and I said, let's talk about this. And he said, of course. So the conversation with T is totally fascinating because it brings out the dark side of transparency. Now, he'll tell you there are good things about transparency as well, but we shouldn't blithely say transparency is good, full stop. There are ways of organizations being transparent, or maybe more to the point, there's ways of requiring organizations to be transparent that are actually counterproductive. They're actually, as you'll hear in the conversation with T, they can undermine what we're trying to do, which is to safeguard people. I think that it makes us, or it ought to make us really think carefully about what we're demanding when we demand transparency and accountability from an organization building AI or other digital technologies, or really anything at all. And one last note, if you like this conversation, you find T's insights as insightful as I do, then you might want to check out his new book, Games, Agency as Art. All right, so let's get to it. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, but as always, what's more important to me, I hope you get something out of it. T, welcome. Thanks so much. Could we start off with you saying just a little bit about what you're thinking about when you say trusted surveillance or transparency of surveillance? Maybe how you think about what constitutes surveillance, what constitutes transparency, and why one is the other.
I started thinking about this when I was thinking about point systems and metrics in general. And in general, I was really interested in the possibility that point system left off crucial amounts of information. So I started researching this stuff when I was researching the nature of games. And one of the things that's really striking about games is how the points are incredibly artificially clear, right? The point system in a game is so much simpler than the point system than what you might care about in ordinary life, right? A point system says collect sheep, collect victory points, whatever. So I started getting really interested in the possibility that people might get super motivated by other point systems elsewhere in life, like rankings and metrics. So I started thinking about things like your points on Twitter, like the likes you have on Twitter, and the citation rate that academics get, and your GPA. And I started looking into this stuff, and one of the places that it got most interesting was that a lot of the metrics that are out there are there for transparency, right? So we have something like there's some realm of researchers researching some arcane piece of whatever, and legislators, public that funds them, they have no idea what's going on. Similar for a nonprofit, right? A nonprofit might be promising that, oh my God, we'll get your money into some impoverished region, do really well with that and do really well with it. But it's really hard to know whether those things are corrupt or not. And so people set up systems of transparency and systems of oversight. A lot of these transparency systems look like simple rankings. So, for example, famously in the charity space, a charity navigator offered a really simple ranking of various charities based on a metric called throughput. That was how much of your donations made it through the charity and were output on the other side, whatever impoverished area help.
Sure.
And one of the things you keep finding over and over again is a lot of the metrics that look really good at first glance are actually terrible. The charity navigator one is a really clear example. So in that metric, so this idea of throughput, the more money you put in, like the more you get on the other side, that seems like a really good metric at first glance. It turns out in operation, it's a terrible metric because insofar as Charity Navigator recommends people to give money to charities that have that have higher throughput, it's forcing charities to compete by cutting internal costs. And at the first stage, that might get rid of an amount of bloat. But at later stage, what that looks like is charities that have already been gutted to the bone can't hire experts, can't hire internal administration, have no money for internal functioning, are forced to continue to try to decrease their internal expenditures to do well on this really simplistic metric. So I was thinking about all this. I found this book from Anara O'Neill on the nature of trust. And there's this moment where she's talking about metrics and she's talking about transparency and she's talking about public oversight. And she says, people think that transparency and trust are together, but they're actually in deep tension because transparency forces experts to explain themselves to non-experts. But by definition, expert reasoning isn't really available to non-experts. The whole reason that we need experts in the first place was because we couldn't understand all the reasoning in a different space. So what she says is that transparency forces experts to explain themselves to non-experts. And since experts' real reasons are expert, they're not actually comprehensible. This forces experts to lie. This forces experts to be deceptive, to invent fake reasons for what they're doing, which undermines trust. So I think this is deeply right, but I think the situation might actually be worse, which is, I think when you look at the empirical literature on what metrics do, in many cases, experts actually change their behavior to fit whatever will look good on the metric. And what I've argued in this paper, Transparency Surveillance, is in many cases, when experts confine themselves to the kinds of actions that can be explained to non-experts, then that actually undermines their expertise. They can't use their full expertise and reason. So there's a lot more to say, but that's the basic view. That insofar as what transparency is explaining things in a way comprehensible to non-experts. And insofar as experts are getting bound to reasons that are explicable to non-experts, the transparency is actually undermining expertise.
Okay, so let me make sure that I've got this right. We need to trust organizations, be they nonprofits or corporations, and specifically, we want to trust that they're going to do or that they're doing what they said they would do. And we want to, even if they didn't say it, we want to trust them to do the right thing at a bare minimum by the lights of laws and regulations. We want to make sure that they're actually doing those things. In we want at in short, we want to make sure that they're acting well, whatever acting well amounts to in that context for that organization. In order to see if they're acting well, one thing that we do is we look at the numbers because numbers are, at least peers, they're easy to see. I guess that's supposed to be the idea. We have various metrics. There are things that we can measure. And so we measure stuff, and then they have to be transparent. They have to share those measurements. And then we, whoever the we is, maybe it's regulators, the general public, whomever is the appropriate we in the context, we determine whether those numbers show them to be, in fact, acting well. And then I take it that you've pointed out two problems. I think there's at least two problems that you pointed out. One is that a lot of times the numbers are just, or the metrics that are developed are just really bad. They're just shitty metrics. They don't track the thing that you think that they're tracking or that you want them to track, or they don't track the things that we ought to be tracking. So that's one thing. We just, by virtue of the metrics that we use, we might have our eyes on the wrong ball, so to speak. So that's one problem. And the other problem that I think that you brought out is that organizations have various experts at their disposal doing the expert work. But in order for them to do their work, they've got to do work that's somewhat opaque to us. That is to say, the non-experts, the regulators or the general public. And insofar as we're asking them to, if you like, show your work, there's a tension there because in order for them to show us their work in a comprehensible way, they're going to have to put it in an inexpert way, in a way that we can comprehend, which means they're just going to have to, I take it one thing that you're saying that they might do is they might just lie to us about what they're actually up to. And they might just give us an intelligible but false articulation of what they're doing and why. Do I have that right? Are those the two big problems? Am I making my connection?
Yeah, that's a really nice way to put it. So, I mean, one way I think about it is, what are we actually trying to do when we use expert and then try to put them under oversight? So oversight works really well if what you're overseeing is somebody doing something within your understanding. So here's cases where oversight might work perfectly, right? So you're my legal proxy. You're acting in my stead because I can't be there, right? Just physically. I just want you to do the things I would have done. I can have perfect oversight over you. I can look at recordings of you. This might be, but I understand what you're trying to do. Similarly, like if I'm the head cook doing oversight over the line cooks in my restaurant, right? Like what I'm having oversight over is something within my realm, something that I can understand. I just don't have enough physically hands and fingers to do all the stuff. So I need to get more. That's one kind of thing. And what's happening there is that the overseer and the overseen have the same kind of expertise.
Mhm.
But what we're doing in the rest of our lives is something really different. We're relying on experts because they understand things that we don't, right? One of the things that's going on in the background here is I think this deep shift in the way that we relate to knowledge and each other that's been happening over the last 300 years that I think in some sense we all know about, but we haven't really thought about the full implication. And that's the fact that knowledge is too large for any single human brain, right? It's funny because I'm a philosopher and what I'm supposed to be teaching people is for yourself, right? Like do all your own research, like
Sure.
figure out, but essential fact of our era is that's completely impossible. One of my favorite philosophers, Elijah Milgram, puts it this way. Modern arguments in the scientific era cross over like 100 specializations, right? To make a claim like climate change is real or this nuclear reactor won't explode. You're crossing nuclear experts, modeling experts, statistical experts, chemical experts. And each of those expertise is so intense that they can't even understand all of the arguments of the expertise the next form over. So my wife is a chemist. She's a Ph.D. in organic chemistry. And I asked her how much of like the statistical methodologies that she uses every day that she understands and how much of the instrumentation she uses. And she's like less than 1%, right?
Mhm.
Like it took like 15 years just to get to her particular specialization. So we're actually forced to do, whether we're scientists or whether we're people like taking an antibiotic or getting on a plane is trusting the expertise of people whose expertise is beyond what we can understand, right? Like, even if I could look at the entire procedure of making this antibiotic or of a mechanic building and rebuilding this airplane, like I couldn't understand it for myself. So in some sense, because of expertise, what experts are doing is essentially opaque to us. And then transparency says, okay, now experts, transparency in the public lens. I want to be really clear that I'm talking not about transparency from one group of experts to another group with the same expert, but publicly oriented transparency. What transparency is asking is to submit for accounting what the experts are doing, which is by definition opaque to the rest of us. And I think let me just try to make this, I think it'll be a little clearer if we just look at particular examples. So one of my favorite examples comes from Jennifer Lena. So Jennifer Lena is a sociologist of art, and she gets really interested in transparency in the arts case, right? So the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, is giving various grants. And at some point, Congress starts accusing them of pork barreling, right? Of like giving grant to their friends or people, that they're buddy with. And it's really hard for someone in the NEA to justify their actions to a non-expert, because what the NEA is doing is it's employing experts who've spent decades in an art realm to search out what's valuable to fund, right? So how do you justify that to someone that has no art history or art appreciation background at all? So what, in this case, the Congress started doing was saying, well, we need to impose a metric that we can comprehend. So what they imposed was box office receipts. He started accusing the NEA of funding badly whenever they funded something that didn't have good sales, right? I think to anyone in the art space, you're like, no, like goodness in art is not the same as sales, right? What sells
Sure, of
well is what's
course.
popular. It's not. Maybe this will make it this clear. Like if what you're asking the expert to do in this case is to use their expertise, to use their judgment from their experience about what might be worthwhile art to fund, that's using kinds of expertise that are by their nature not transparent.
So suppose I say, okay, so the core issue here is something like the non-translatability of ethical expertise to
Mhm.
non-experts. It's something like that. And so when you say something like transparency of surveillance, it's something like if you've got some entity, maybe it's Congress, responsible for oversight of an organization where the organization crucially has experts doing some expert work, then it's not, if you like, the fact that Congress is looking. It's not the mere fact that they are asking, that they're looking around, that they're poking around or something along those lines. It's not the fact that they're surveilling. It's that they couldn't possibly surveil effectively because those Congress people are not sufficiently expert to understand what it is they're looking at.
I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, this is a good point to say that I'm not saying that transparency is bad, because
Right.
I don't think that surveillance is bad. I think the right view is, so by the way, the standard definition of surveillance I'm using is just oversight to look for possible bad action, right?
So
That's all it is. And transparency, it seems like, is, so in some sense, I don't, this is just a straightforward definitional claim. Like what transparency is oversight looking for bad action. I think what we have some basic, I'm when I have that title, I'm trying to engage some of our basic intuitions. I think most of us don't think surveillance is always bad. What we think is surveillance is intrusive and harmful. It should be only used when we have a really good reason to think that the thing might be really dangerous or might be genuinely corrupt.
sure.
So I think one of the things about surveillance is it disrupts the actions of the things it's looking at, right? At the same time as it actually sometimes ferrets out corruption and bias.
Okay, so that's actually a layer deeper than before. So before, it's not an opposition, just another layer. Before, the main issue was the surveillance is going to wind up being not because it's something, an invasion of privacy or an overstep of authority or something along those lines. Before, it was bad because they're going to do it poorly. They're going to look at, they're not going to understand what it is they're looking at. But now you brought in another layer, which is something, the act of surveilling actually causes harm. Do I have that right? So draw that out. What are the What's the harm or the harms that are visited upon the surveilled, even if
Right.
it's something like, committee of Congress who has the proper authority to oversee it?
So this is a great question. So there's a bunch of ways to unpack this. So first, right, one- as you said, one of the possible harms of surveillance was mere observation itself being looked at. That might be harmful, but that's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about an actual change in what's going on. That can happen in two ways. So one, insofar as the surveillors have the ability to cut funding, right? Then they can disrupt activity. And they're doing so not from without understanding exactly what they're looking at. So, I mean, the really simple version of this is think about the art story. If Congress starts taking funding away from the NEA, if they fund unpopular projects, right? And only permitting the funding of popular projects. They've just changed the nature of arts funding, and they've changed it guided by a really, I think, kind of inept understanding of the value of the situation.
Sure.
I think the thing that I'm really worried about, and the thing that you see over and over again in the empirical literature, looks like this. So some oversight committee says, okay, you have to target this metric that we can understand. And that metric is something that, because of the constraint of public accessibility, can't actually capture the complexity of the situation. So people in the space, the experts, start guiding their actions constrained by hitting that metric. So what this looks like in this case is like the NEA starts funding only the kinds of art that will be popular, right? And have big box office returns because they know that their funding will be cut otherwise. And this looks, but this, so the NEA example is kind of, I think to a lot of people, maybe a minor one. Here's a much bigger one. So the incentives in science right now are driven by a bunch of things, but a lot of those incentives are either A, being able to grants, right? Or B, having papers that are highly cited. Those are very visible metrics, right? Anyone can say, look, I'm a statistical scientist. Look at all the grants I've gotten and look at all the citations I've gotten. But citations and grants are a really imperfect rendering of worthwhile research. In particular, for example, one of the worries right now is in the grant space that it's hard to get grants, that it's easy to get grants in spaces that are already well explored and hard to get grants in spaces that are relatively new, right? So on
Is
the
that because
surface,
safer bet?
yeah. So on the surface, these metrics look good to the outside observer, right? But they're missing much of what's of substance. And so the worry is insofar as they're missing what's important and they're driving action in the space, then the action in the space is actually deeply constrained. So let me give you one more example. As, so something that's happening in my life, more and more universities are moving towards transparent metrics over teaching. And those metrics are the kind of metrics that are quickly gatherable at scale, standardized across the institution, and the kind of thing that an outside legislature could understand. So what those metrics always look like is graduation rate, graduation speed, post-graduation employment rate, satisfaction surveys. What they don't show is things like increased humility, increased reflectivity, increased intellectual curiosity. Those aren't easily measurable in a publicly accessible way. And I think if once you target those, you lose, look at all the stuff you lose. That's the worry.
So I kind of want to say, and you tell me if this is not, if I'm failing to capture what you're saying. I kind of want to put it even a bit stronger. It sounds to me like what you're saying is something transparency is, can be in some cases, self-undermining. Because the goal of the overseers, of their surveillors, is to make sure that those they're surveilling, the people that they're overseeing, are doing well, that they're doing well at whatever it is they're supposed to be doing. That's supposed to be the idea. So if you're a nonprofit, then you are running your organization in a way that's commensurate with your mission to help the people that you intend, something along those lines. If you're a university, you're running it well on roughly the condition that you are sufficiently educating students, perhaps cultivating certain kinds of intellectual virtues like curiosity, not to mention just learning things, being able to write well, et cetera, et cetera. So their goal is to make sure that those that they're surveilling are doing well. But because they don't understand what it is they're surveilling, they use these simplified metrics or these metrics that don't track what ought to be tracked, in fact, which then causes the organization, including the experts within that organization, to change their behavior in such a way that it lives up to the metrics instead of to actually live it to what it would be to do well there. And so the surveillance has an undermining of not only is it not accurately tracking whether those that are surveilling are doing well, it's actually undermining their ability to do well.
100%. That is, I wish you had said that before I published the paper, because I would use what you just said as my goddamn abstract, because that is exactly what I mean. So let me spin out a little, let me give you some examples and spin out what you said, but that is exactly right. The worry is that the oversight is undermining the activity of experts because it's binding their activity to a non-expert understanding. So let me just start with some examples. So one of the things you find over and over again in the nonprofit sector is, okay, I think one of the core background thoughts here is that it's not that experts are just good at instrumentally doing something. It's that they understand what's valuable to do, right? They understand what really needs to get done. So I think people in the arts understand what's valuable about art in their terrain of art more deeply. People in education understand, I think I understand what's valuable about a philosophy education more than people that haven't been steeped in philosophy. And I think I don't really understand what's valuable in, say, a statistics education, and I should defer there. And you get these really funky cases in the nonprofit. So when you let quick outsiders set the targets, they set targets really badly. So do you know about this? So in conservation and environmental conservation, what it's really easy to get the general public excited about is what they call is charismatic animals. So for example, it's really easy. Do you know about this? So
No,
it's
I
really
don't.
easy to get tons and tons and tons of funding for pandas because pandas are big and cute. They're actually one of the least important species to save. For example, what's much more important is like, this will be surprising. There's lots of really gross insects that are incredibly crucial to large scale ecosystems. You can't get money because the public doesn't get excited about that.
Right.
Similarly, I was just hearing something. I need to research this more, but people were telling me about how in a lot of heavily impoverished areas, what people actually need is big infrastructure like water and roads, and a lot of the times just infusions of cash to get done lots of small scale repairs. What American charities get really excited by are, you might call them charismatic technologies, like cool ideas, like we're going to send out solar powered laptops for the kid,
Mhm.
or we're right. And what people in the space say is you go into heavily impoverished areas that have been targeted by distant charities, and you just find the litter of all these crappy Silicon Valley projects that look cool but don't address an actual need,
Hmm.
right? So, so one way to put it, the less deep way, is that experts in the space are much better at understanding what interventions need to look like. I think
Mhm.
an even deeper thought is that expertise is not just of the technical instrumental way to get there, but it's about what's important in the space. Okay? Like the what the value looks like. And so a basic problem with publicly accessible metrics is they have to have a rendition of value comprehensible to everyone. And if you believe what I just said, that's just going to miss what's important about the space and the best ways to get there, right? Justification, public transparency demands justifications in the terms that non-experts can understand. By the way, I just want to say here as an insert before I sound like a elitist asshole, I'm not saying that there's like the expert of whom I am one, and then the non-expert. What I'm saying is that every realm is incredibly complicated, and that even if everyone is an expert in one terrain, they're not an expert in the 2 million other specialties in the world.
So, okay, so let me we're all, let's put it slightly differently. We're all an expert at lots of stuff.
Most of
Most stuff, right? I mean, if we have an expertise in something, it's probably one thing. Maybe you have expertise in a handful of things. Of all take the set of things, it's quite large. And so whatever your expertise covers is going to be an extremely small fraction of that set. Things about which one could be an expert.
and can I push a little? Can I say one more thing here,
Yeah.
which is, so I don't just mean formal expertise. So one of the things I say in the paper is There's a lot of reason to think that there are experiential expertises. So there's in the part of philosophy I live in, there's something called standpoint epistemology. And one of the thoughts is something like, look, if you live life in a particular way, like say being a gay person in Utah, which is a screwed up place to be a gay person, right? If you live life under under a particular identity that's received a particular kind of oppression or hostility or bias, you understand things about the nature of living that way that are not obvious to outsiders. So you can consider this a kind of expertise, right? It's a kind of experiential expertise. So this applies. So one of the places I actually really got interested in this was the specific case of an LGBTQ student group and department under the oversight of, under the claim of transparency to a board of directors who none of whom had the experience of being a gay person in Utah, right? And I think that's another case where the particular special understanding that an expertise that arises from living a particular way doesn't necessarily survive the justificatory process demanded by public transparency.
Okay, so there's a lot of things going on here. So I want to come back to this point about the kinds. It sounds like there's different kinds of expertise.
Okay.
You might think that there's some kinds of expertise that consist in having a certain set of knowledge. Right? So maybe you're an expert about World War II because you know tons of stuff about what happened in during World War II. But you might have a kind of skill expertise. So you could be an expert rock climber, and you're an expert by virtue of having a bunch of knowledge, but of a certain kind of skill. And then it sounds like there's another kind of expertise, the one that you're referring to now, which is something like, it's something like by virtue of your experience having access to a certain, I think it's still might be knowledge, but it might be knowledge that if you like, it's not knowledge that's accessible to, the empirical scientist or something along those lines. It's knowledge you have access to by virtue of certain kinds of experiences you've had.
I mean, there's unimportant stuff to quibble about because I think those all collapse together. But one of the really interesting things to think about here is any reasonable account of expertise. I don't just mean philosophical. If you look at the psychologists, cognitive psychologists, any kind of expertise includes something like this. A lot of expertise occurs in the expert without explicit justification, right? What it is to be an expert is you have all this experience and you can kind of look and see and have this kind of immediate, clear intuition about what's going on. So one of the things, there's a lot of studies about radiologists, emergency room doctors, and early on they have to use diagnostic procedures. But when they get good, what happens is they walk in and they can just see this person doesn't have enough oxygen. That person is having an enormous amount of trouble, right? And so a lot of expertise involves a movement beyond clear, explicit principles to this kind of quick synthetic judgment. But typical transparency procedures ask what's going on to be put in terms of clear, verbally explicit justifications. And I mean, so Herbert Simon and the name of early philosopher in the AI and skill space, one of their major worries was that if you were trying to get procedures written in explicit rules and policies, you could only capture how a novice did. You couldn't capture the subtle level of expertise. But one of the problems, okay, this is part of the history of transparency, is that inside intuition and these quick synthetic judgments, it's also where bias lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's that. So a lot of transparency procedures are put into place to get rid of bias, to get rid of nepotism. And they target these kind of intuitive, inchoate judgments precisely because that is where bias shows itself. But my worry is that that's where bias lives and it's where trained expert judgment lives. And if you try to move us off of that kind of thing into a kind of explicit, explainable, justifiable, accessible procedure, you definitely get rid of bias, but you also get rid of expertise, right?
So let me see if I have this right. I mean, it seems like part of what it is to be an expert is to sort of know the space so well that you can move almost seamlessly through it. It's something
Right.
like you're not just following rules, although there may be some loose rules you've got in the background, but it's something to do with increased sensitivity to
Right.
the various features of the context. So the person goes into the emergency room, the doctor, the one who just finished his residency, he's going through a checklist. Whereas the doctor who's been there for 20 years, she walks in and she sort of gets a grip on the situation immediately, understands what's going on, understands what the priorities are, without going either implicitly or explicitly through any kind of checklist. So the expertise is a kind of sensitivity to the various features of a context that are salient.
Exactly.
So I get that. And that looks like that looks really, really important. And it's one reason why best practices, so-called
Right.
best practices are, they are explicitly for the non-expert. And I see this with some clients that I work with when it comes to ethical deliberation or deliberations about ethical risks in, say, an AI context. They want best practices. And I sort of want to say, well, no ethicist is going to give you a list of best practices for ethical deliberation. That's not what they do. They just do the deliberation. They do the work. So we want that kind of expertise. And then I take it the problem is, okay, but suppose you give me an expert university admissions counselor or something along those lines. They've been doing this for 20 years. They take a quick look at the application and they're like, yeah, that's a good candidate. No, it's a good candidate. And then the concern is that, yeah, but maybe what they're sensitive to is that person's white and that person's black. And they might not articulate it that way, but their unconscious or implicit or whatever you want to call them biases, they are sensitive to features of the context that they ought not to be sensitive to, like
Right.
the race of the applicant, for instance, or the gender,
Exactly.
ethnicity, whatever.
Exactly.
And then the response to that is quite natural, which is to say, no, we need explicit, clear criteria for admissions to the university to make sure that the university process, the admissions process is fair, just, equitable, whatever. And I think you feel the pull of that. And you want to point out, but this is a balancing act because the more you make it explicit, the more you make it, these are best practices, the more you make those rules for admission intelligible to all, the more you decrease the expertise that's involved. And so you're going to get worse outcomes.
That is 100% exactly it.
Okay.
Thank you for making everything I want to say clear. And yeah, the simple version of my conclusion is not transparency, but
Yeah.
there's a very good reason to have transparency, and there's a very good reason to worry about transparency. The transparency has a benefit and a heavy cost.
Yeah.
Right. It is decorrupting. It is debiasing. Transparency efforts have historically rooted out racial bias, gender bias, all kinds of bias.
Yeah.
And clear, simple metrics are the method by which large-scale institutions have been correctly convinced that to worry about the fact that 95% of their philosophy professors are white, right? That is absolutely the positive benefit of transparency. But if we push the dial all the other way to everything needs to be explicit, all decisions need to be determined by policy, right? Then we lose the benefits of expertise. So my claim has always been that this is always a compromise. There is no perfect solve. And that at least looking around the world, one of the things I worry about is a backlash against the older world of all intuitions and sustaining kinds of bias to a new world of all transparency, all explicit procedure, all best practices, which eliminates expertise. So you're going to have to compromise somewhere in between there, and it's going to hurt. That's the claim.
It's going to hurt. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. So transparency is valuable. There's great things about it. It's not the only thing that we care about. We also care about the institution, the organization, the corporation, whatever, the product team, it doesn't matter, doing well. And these things can come apart. And so we have to find the appropriate way of balancing these things. So let me give you tell me, here's a proposal. It's narrow, but I just sort of interested to hear your take on it. So maybe I say, oh, look, okay, so the answer is that those who are surveilling, those non-experts that are overseeing, they need to incorporate some subject matter experts into this thing. Right? They need to get the experts on their side to help them understand the other experts that they are surveilling. So I know the answer is no, but I'm just going to ask it almost rhetorically. Right. Is the quick and somewhat easy answer, let's just get experts involved on the surveiller side?
Right. So in some sense, that's got to be the right direction, right? Like a lot of the cases that are the worst are one immediate step where the public in general picks the metric and applies the metric, right? The reason why there's not a so something like that direction has got to be the right, but it's harder than it looks because the same surveillance problem recurs on the experts on technically the surveiller side. So this is what this looks like. So let's take an example. So we don't know anything about pharmaceuticals. So we set up a regulatory agency, the FDA, to regulate pharmaceutical experts on our side. Now, how do we know they're on our side? There's actually this effect. It's called regulatory capture, where the regulators' interests become more aligned with those they're regulating rather than those who they're supposed to be regulating on behalf of. What this looks like is either regulators spend more time with their targets than with general population. They become friends. Or more insidiously, one of the things we know is that if you've been an FDA regulator for a long time, when you retire, you can get a really posh job with pharmaceutical companies dealing with regulators from the other side. So now we have another problem. We have expert regulators. Now we need oversight over what they're doing. How do we do that? The problem is, if you have a trust problem, putting more layers just kind of moves the trust problem over. Now you have more reason to think of the regulators' interests will be aligned with the general public's than those they're regulating, but still, it's an imperfect procedure precisely because of the opacity of expertise, right? If you still have a problem where any body of expert, you need to figure out if you trust them or not, and their actions, because they're expert, are opaque. Putting more layers of expert in, it's going to ease the problem because you can change the incentive structure a little bit, but it's not going to perfectly solve them because you're still going to need oversight procedures. And one worrisome thing is going to be if your oversight procedures pick who the expert regulators are, and you do so from a place of inexpertise, you might pick bad regulators. And I think we see that in various places.
Okay, so if I have this right, there are at least two issues. One is that you're the non-experts. You got to hire the experts to
Right.
sort of be on your team, but you don't even know how to spot an expert.
Right.
So you're going to choose criteria to choose those experts, and you're not even sure whether those criteria are good criteria. So that sounds like one issue, just sort of bad hiring. For all you know, it's bad hiring.
Right.
The other issue, though, I take it is you've got the experts on your team. How do you check their work? Well, you
Right.
can't look at their assessments because you can't understand them. That's why you hired them in the first place, those
Right.
assessments. And then the concern creeps in, which we've talked about already, which is perhaps they're biased in certain ways, or perhaps they're compromised in certain ways. Perhaps they're compromised by virtue of the fact that what they're aiming for is a job from that pharmaceutical company in 5 years.
Right.
And so you have one, you don't know if you're hiring well because you don't know how to assess whether they're experts. And two, once they're on board, you don't know how to assess the quality of their work and or whether the quality is biased or otherwise compromised.
That is so correct. One. And two, I think it's a good way to point our way to like the biggest version of the problem. Cause here's a reveal. The problem I've been working on 15 years of my intellectual life is the problem of how non-experts identify the correct experts to trust.
Mm-hmm.
Amusingly, 15 years ago, when I was working on this, people were like, why are you working on this? What an obscure problem. And now the world has kind of been like, oh, well, I see why you were worried about that.
Uh-huh.
I think in some sense, people want to underplay this problem, but I think this is just the deep structural problem that arises because of the size of human knowledge. This is not something that there's an easy way around. It's there because the size of what we need to understand is larger than us as individuals. And so as individuals, we need to join together in vast collectives and start trusting each other and other experts. But by definition, we don't have the expertise to judge other people.
So
let me talk about one way out and problematize it. So there might be a way out. So this is like earliest stuff I ever wrote in philosophy. There might be a way out if there were a good, let's call it a litmus test. So a litmus test is if an expertise, if the products of their expert are easily accessible by a non-expert. So maybe an example is people that build bridges and build planes, right? The non-expert can tell that bridge builders built a good bridge because it doesn't fall over. Although, let's be clear. I can assess a bridge that's 30 years old, but how do I assess a new bridge, right? So maybe what I'm assessing is the bridge building profession as a whole, right? So I have to be, so sorry. So the litmus test thing should work, but it also gets really complicated because if I'm assessing bridge builders now based on the fact that 30-year-old bridge builders, 30-year-old bridges are still standing, then I have an assumption in place that nothing in particular has changed at that institution, right? Which involves me needing to know all of what's going on in that institution. So that's so that if there are litmus tests, that would be really good. And one of the worries I've another worry I have, and this will take us into the AI space, is that we might have some litmus tests, good litmus tests, and then other stuff elsewhere that we really care about for which there's no litmus test. So let me give you a quick example. Okay, here's a litmus test for AI. AI are really good at beating humans at chess. Awesome. Okay. Now, here's the question. Does that mean because they passed that litmus test that we should trust machine learning algorithms to figure out way more complicated things for which there's no clear, simple binary adjudication? Right. Okay, you were going to say something. That I'm now taking you to the place as far as I understand. This is where I am stuck in tortures.
Well, okay. I mean, I'm going to give you not the answer that I think is correct, but here's the answer that the AI community is going to give to you. You're right. Knowledge has become so fractured that no single human can possibly collect all that knowledge. But what we've got now is AI. We have things like ChatGPT and 4 coming out of the line in ChatGPT 5. So the answer is that the all-knowing expert on such things will be the AI. And then, so first of all, we got to, that's going to be one issue. Then we're going to start talking about whether there's actual expertise there, whether there's actual knowledge, whether there's actual understanding. Cliff note version, no. But that's a long road to convince people that the answer is no. And then the other thing to say is, well, we can't explain how the AI got to those outputs. You've got this AI engage in this phenomenal number crunching to give you the so-called expert opinion, but we can't explain how it came to that conclusion. So how do we trust that the black box, the all-knowing black box actually is all-knowing? And then, of course, what they're going to say is, well, we need transparency there. We need to explain it. We need to be able to explain what's going on in there. And now we're back. We're back in a quagmire.
Yeah. My guess, and I'm speaking here as not an expert in AI at all, my guess is that if what I've said applies in that case, then you're getting the same problem, which is if you go for all transparency, then you'll need the procedures in the machine to be comprehensible to some human. And so then it won't be able to exceed humans. But if you want it to exceed humans, then it'll do stuff that we can't decode and understand. And then we have to trust it. Now the question is there a good reason to trust it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is sort of, and talk about explainability in AI. This is one of the major issues, which is the reason that AI can be so accurate when it is accurate is precisely because it can recognize phenomenally complex patterns. Standardly, we humans can't understand. So you turn up the volume on accuracy, you're thereby turning down the volume on explainability or intelligibility. You can turn down the volume on complexity so that we get more understanding, we get more explainability, but now you're turning down its accuracy. You're getting it to be an expert. And so there's this tension between where do we put that line between explainability and accuracy? And then there's various kind of techniques for trying to figure out what's going on inside the black box. But then the worry is that those explanations are necessarily oversimplifications and thus distortions of what's going on. And that sounds a lot like your experts trying to dumb it down to the non-experts in such a way that the non-experts understand, but now they're compromising their expertise. So the problem just keeps repeating itself.
Yes.
All right. Well, on that happy note, it's a real issue. It's a problem, and I hope you'll come back and we'll talk about it some more sometime.
Thank you so much, man.
No, it's great. And for all for all of you out there who found this totally fascinating, I also recommend you check out Thi's new book, Games Agency as Art. You can certainly find it on Amazon and other booksellers as well. Again, Thi, thanks so much, and talk to you again.